Hello again. I'm Dia Sakai, Assistant Director for Education at the Center for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning, CETL, at Georgia Tech.
And I'm Carol Sabino-Sullivan, the Coordinator of Teaching Assistant Development at CETL.
We hope you found the first two segments of this teaching statement tutorial helpful. If by chance you haven't had the opportunity to view the first two segments, please take the time to do so before you view this third segment. Carol and I are back to help you with the next part of your teaching statement. So now that you've identified appropriate learning goals and proper ways to teach those learning goals, we are here to help you to figure out how to assess both student learning and your teaching effectiveness. So Carol, can you tell us the next steps?
Sure. So when we're talking about assessment, we want to look at two different dimensions. One is you want to find out, did your students actually learn what you hoped that they learned? And so when we're thinking about assessing student learning, there's a few different elements that I look for. One is, what did you actually design? What instruments, what assignments did you design to actually collect that kind of information from students? Secondly, I want to see your reflection. So it's not just sort of blame the students for how they did, but sort of taking into account, okay, students seem to be largely successful on this, but they fell down a bit on this. How do I take that information, reflect it back into how I should be teaching? And then that's the final part. How did you actually respond? So if you've had the fortune to get a chance to teach that particular material again, what did you do the second time around that shows that you were adapting to the performance of your students? So that was the first component of assessment. The second component of assessment is assessing your teaching effectiveness. And this usually comes in the form of feedback from somebody else. So your prime audience are actually your students. So I'm looking for, in what ways did you collect feedback from your students? It could also be from a peer that comes observe you, or maybe a supervisor that comes observe you. How did you collect feedback from them? And then the second part of that is the reflection. You know, what did you do once you got that feedback? How did you think about your teaching? What you should change? What should you keep doing?
Okay, thanks, Carol. I understand that you have a few examples to share with us of people who did a good job at this section, so would you share those with us now?
Yeah, so let's take a look at this first example I brought in from physics. So I think this example is a great one for showing us how this instructor really carefully looks at student learning and uses student performance in order to think about how they should be approaching teaching. So we see that, one, we're back to that learning goal, helping students develop a sense for problem solving. That's the goal here. And then we see that the first time around, the instructor was helping students with solving homework problems. They were not clearly identifying the system and surroundings, nor the initial and final state. So some specific things within the field of physics. And they were committing certain types of mistakes. So that is, the assignment was the homework, the feedback was this type of mistakes, and then it goes beyond that. It's a reflection, or it's a noticing, okay, there's an issue here. So this instructor got a chance to try again. Later on, another student asked me for help on how to get started with problem solving. From my experience, I knew I'd need to explain it to him in detail on how to address those common errors that they described before. Okay, so they adjusted based on that feedback, and then the instructor collects more feedback. First, I saw the moment of understanding in his eyes. So there's an informal way of collecting feedback. Most of us who've taught sort of get that vibe, but the instructor didn't stop there. They wanted to really check to make sure that that glimmer was really telling the truth. So I then gave him a practice problem, and he was able to perform every step correctly, right? So that's solid feedback. Okay, this time what I tried worked for that student. So we have a really nice arc there of trying something, it didn't work, I tried something different, and now, the students are getting it.
Okay, thanks, Carol. That was a great example of assessment of student learning. So how about an example of the assessment, the self-assessment of teaching?
Yes. So this one is from an engineering instructor. So let's just look through that real quick. Okay. So in this one, the instructor felt that they really needed to get some feedback from their students, and they didn't have an official teaching evaluation that got administered for them. So they took it upon themselves, which is a great strategy. So they tried to ask their students what were the good and the bad parts. And from that feedback, this instructor learned that for students, understanding the fundamentals and solving problems are something totally different to them. So based on that feedback, this instructor then went on to develop a teaching method that responded to that. And just as an aside, this is a really great example of how to integrate that earlier video we talked about teaching methods with this assessment piece. They're not two separate things. So tried this new approach. Also wrapped up in that was the students perceived different importance on the method. So if it was PowerPoint on the board, so took those two pieces of feedback and then taught accordingly. The students thanks to my students, I discovered my own way to integrate the understanding and problem-solving process at the same time, and I found this method effective to my students. So we have a really nice, example there of how by soliciting specific feedback from the students, they were able to move their teaching towards a more effective implementation.
And of course, we'd want to somehow integrate the assessment of student learning and our teaching effectiveness. So do you have an example that does that?
Yes, actually, I'm glad you asked. So I brought in one more example for us to look like exactly for that reason that you just shared. So remember, we're talking about these two assessment pieces. One is looking at student learning to inform our teaching, and then looking at direct feedback about our teaching. Well, what if these two things say something contradictory to each other? What do we do with that? And this is exactly the dilemma that this math instructor faced. So let's just look at that really quick. Okay, so in this time, we see that the instructor first tried an approach to teaching that involved group work, and this is what the students had to say about that. I tried group work, and the entire class said they hated it. Oops. So the instructor went on, they didn't want the students to hate the class, so they reduced the amount of group work in the class, and did mostly lecture. However, after 2 weeks, the students had their first test. They did not do as well as I hoped, right? And so here is the assessment of student learning, right? The assignment, the instrument was the test, and the students performed in a way. So the instructor then reflected on that and said, okay, what I did didn't work. So the instructor then switched back to my standard method, lecture, examples, and then group work. Even though the students still complained, there was a vast improvement in grades on the next test, right? So this is a really nice example of that interplay, right? Collecting feedback from the students, then doing student learning assessment, and then readjusting, right? So bringing the two in conversation. And that really gives you the most solid idea of how well your teaching is hitting home and what should your appropriate course of action be as you steer and revise.
Okay, great. So clearly these two examples reflect multiple iterations and refinement of the document. However, will you be able to share some with us that are a little earlier on in the process?
Sure. I brought in an example from an engineering class of an early draft. So let's just look through that really quick. And so I brought this in mainly because I think this is the most common error in a first draft of a teaching statement, and that is that there isn't very much reflection. It can feel very scary to expose something that didn't work well the first time you did it. And so there's a tendency to try to be overly cheerful almost, to like kind of put your best foot forward and say everything I tried just went great, or only talk about the things that went great. But those of us who teach know that that is so rare, and there's always something to improve on, and so it really behooves you to step back, break it open a little bit, talk about the wrinkles as well as the glow.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that. Are there final thoughts you have on this section of the teaching statement?
Yeah, so especially for graduate students who are writing their first teaching statement, they might feel like they don't have enough to talk about. They've never taught a class on their own, and a common mistake can be to speak in such general terms that it's difficult for us to really get a sense of what's going on. I would really advise use what you have. If you've done one guest lecture, really talk about that guest lecture. If you've done tutoring or office hours, talk about your experiences there. Even if it's like outreach in a museum or some other kind of community context, all of that is valuable material that you can use to get into the learning goals, the teaching methods, and the assessment that we've been covering in this video series.
Okay. Thanks, Carol.
You're welcome.